Slavoj Žižek is a Slovenian philosopher, culture and film analyst. He is often in the limelight with his provocative and insightful comments on contemporary politics and culture. Žižek was intrigued by Lacan's concept of fantasy. We talked about the three phases of need, demand, and desire, which are connected with the entry of a child into the three stages or orders: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. The child experiences need as a part of its biological makeup and needs food, warmth, and comfort. These needs are met by the guardian, maybe the mother or the father, or somebody who takes care of the child. This changes to demand when the baby realizes that it has a self separate from that of the mother. For example, it cries, demanding its mother to meet its needs. This is a demand made by the child. But even after its needs are met, some part of that lack still remains in the child. This is desire. Desire for Lacan indicates an unfulfillable longing, which is necessarily a sexual or libidinal feeling. Lacan argues that desire is the result of the necessary splitting of the human mind into the ego and the unconscious, into a notion of the self and the other. This is required for the child to develop or mature. The split can never be healed, and hence desire is the human condition, the constant unattainable longing for a reunion between the self and the other. Once the child realizes that it is separated from the mother, it feels the lack or a loss. The formation of ego, which happens via identification with the image or the other, compensates for this loss. The demand for recognition from others and the demand to meet the needs changes to desire in the symbolic order. The desire is the desire for reaching the center or the phallus. This is an impossible condition and means that desires exist perpetually. Now, Lacan talks about fantasy. For Lacan, fantasy is the defense mechanism created by the mind to protect the ego from having to face this inherent loss. ഒരു നഷ്ടമുണ്ട് എന്നുള്ളത് മനസ്സിനറിയാം, പക്ഷെ ആ ഒരു നഷ്ടം ശരിക്കും ഫേസ് ചെയ്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരുപാട് പ്രശ്നങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാകാം. യു മൈറ്റ് ലൂസ് കൺട്രോൾ ഓഫ് യുവർ മൈൻഡ്. സോ ഇൻ ഓർഡർ ടു പ്രൊട്ടക്ട് the mind creates a fantasy, and we see the world through this fantasy. Fantasy protects us from the angst of this lack or loss. Unlike Freud, for whom the fantasy was an illusory product of our imagination, Lacan sees it as a mode of defense for the self. Žižek also thinks along Lacanian lines. Since Lacan uses the term phallus to represent the center, fantasy is also spelled as fantasy, incorporating the ph, the two letters from its association with the phallus. Žižek agrees with Lacan in the role of fantasy in shaping our selfhood. Our reality, or the way we view the world, is shaped by our fantasy. It is a frame through which we understand reality. The only alternative is psychosis, complete break from reality. So whatever we see, we are seeing through this framework, which Lacan or Žižek calls it as fantasy. Žižek argues in The Plague of Fantasies that fantasy is the primordial form of narrative and that it serves to hide the impossibility of the fulfillment of desire. Fantasy hides the fact that the actual object we receive cannot match the one it imagines. The object we get can never match desire. Any object that we see, say a watch, is seen or understood through our framework of fantasy, which is directed by our desire. Žižek states that objective gaze does not really exist. So whatever we are seeing, whatever objects we see, they're all seen through this framework of fantasy, which is driven by the desire. This is a system which drives itself. The desire is thus endlessly reproduced in our fantasies and is never fulfilled. If the ego comes in direct contact with the realization of this loss, it causes either psychosis or a break from the connection with reality as it existed until then. Žižek gives an example of how fantasy protects us from the real of our desire. He does a rereading of a story told by Freud. A father loses his child to some illness. He is feeling guilty for not saving the child. The dead body of the child is in the next room. The room is lit with candles and an old man is sitting there. The father falls asleep in the next room and dreams of the child holding his hand and accusing him of not doing enough to save him. The child says, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" Unknown to the father, one of the candles kept near the child in the other room has fallen onto the hand of the dead child, and the wrappings of the cloth had caught fire. So the hand of the child is literally burning, and the father is seeing this dream in his mind. He keeps dreaming and tries to keep dreaming in the hope that he can see the child for a longer time. He does not want to awake, because if he comes out of the dream, then he loses his child, right? In his dream, he is being with his child. The moment he comes out of his dream, that image of the child leaves him. So he is prolonging that the time he sleeps. He is clinging on to that dream so that he sleeps more. But then the external circumstances have changed. There is fire, there is smoke, and this external stimuli, it awakens the father. And the father rushes to the room and sees what is happening. Žižek interprets this by saying that the father awoke not just because of that external stimuli, but also to escape from the real of his desire, the loss or the guilt he is feeling, which he faces when the child appeared in his dream. To escape facing that reality of not doing enough to save the child. To escape that reality in his dream, he is coming out of that dream into this reality, which is fantasy. The reality of this world is more bearable for him than the reality which he witnessed in his dream. Žižek calls this reality that he saw, that he came face to face in his dream, the Lacanian real. That is the original reality which he came to face. The father has seen what he has lost. The guilt is really hurting him. That is the real. That is what Lacan calls the real of the desire, or the Lacanian real. Žižek tells that fantasy is creating a dream-like experience for us, and we call this reality. We feel that this is our reality because fantasy is protecting our inner loss, and we see a reality which is created by our mind. This is what Žižek calls fantasy. It creates a world through which we understand what is in front of us. We experience the world through the fantasy. It protects us from a head-on experience with the lack inherent in us or the loss. The fantasy is compared to a screen or an open space for the projection of desires. Žižek gives a reading of Patricia Highsmith's short story, Black House, to explain further. In a small American town, old men gather in a bar and they say stories about an old house, a haunted house where these men had certain experiences, maybe sexual in nature. When they were young, they used to hang around the house and they had some kind of adventurous experiences. Now they say that the house is spooky and dangerous for anyone to enter. A young man hears these stories and goes on to check out what's really happening with the house. So he goes there and there's nothing really special about the house, nothing spooky. So he comes back and tells them that their stories are hogwash or nonsense and that there is nothing spooky or problematic about the house. Their fantasy, the fantasy of the old men, it's shattered. Unable to get accustomed to this knowledge of reality, one of the old men attacks and kills the man. The annulment or removal of the difference between the fantasy space, which is the house, and the real mundane world evokes fear in the old man. The old man faces the reality or loss when the fantasy is ripped apart by the young man. So let me sum up. Fantasy, according to Zizek, is what constructs the reality for us. We see the world as it is through this framework. It protects us from the real of our desire or from realizing the impossibility of achieving a union with the real when we had separated from our mother.